Imagine two superpowers, each armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, staring each other down over a city divided by ideology. In 1961, that standoff became reality as tanks from the United States and Soviet Union faced off in Berlin, a confrontation that could have turned the Cold War hot. After the devastation of World War II, Berlin found itself at the epicenter of Cold War tensions. The city was divided into four sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. But by 1961, Berlin was more than just a divided city. It was a symbolic battleground between democracy and communism. The Berlin Wall, built by the East German government with Soviet backing, was meant to stop the flood of East Berliners escaping to the West. It was a physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain dividing Europe. At the heart of this Cold War conflict was Checkpoint Charlie, the most famous border crossing between East and West Berlin. It was here, in October 1961, that things nearly spiraled out of control. The trouble began when the East Germans refused to allow U.S. officials to cross into East Berlin without showing identification. This violated the post-war agreements, and the U.S. was not about to back down. Soon American and Soviet tanks were positioned just a few hundred feet apart, guns aimed directly at each other. On October 27, 1961, 10 American M48 Patton tanks rolled up to Checkpoint Charlie, taking position. The Soviets responded in kind, sending their own T-55 tanks to meet them. For the first time in the Cold War, US and Soviet tanks were facing each other with only 100 bread. The world held its breath. One wrong move, one misinterpreted order, and the Cold War could have turned into World War III. Both sides were armed, not just with conventional weapons, but with the threat of nuclear retaliation looming over every decision. While tanks faced each other in Berlin, frantic diplomatic efforts were underway behind the scenes. U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev knew they were on the brink of disaster. Neither leader wanted to be the one responsible for igniting a global conflict. Both sides had to tread carefully. Kennedy understood that backing down would make the U.S. look weak, but he also knew that escalating tensions could lead to nuclear war. At the same time, Khrushchev had his own challenges, trying to maintain Soviet control over East Berlin without sparking a global conflict. After 16 hours of intense standoff, the moment of truth finally came. Through careful back-channel communications, both sides agreed to de-escalate. One by one, the Soviet tanks began to pull back. Shortly after, the U.S. tanks followed suit. With the tanks withdrawing, the immediate danger was over. But the standoff at Checkpoint Charlie remained a symbol of just how close the world had come to another devastating war. For 16 hours, we had stood at the brink of global destruction. The tank face-off in Berlin may not have resulted in any casualties, but its legacy lives on. It served as a stark reminder of the dangers of the Cold War and the razor's edge on which global peace rested. This was one of the many moments where cool heads and diplomacy averted disaster. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev would continue to grapple with Cold War tensions, leading to other high-stakes moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the tank standoff in Berlin was a rare and terrifying instance where the Cold War almost became very real. I remember learning about this incident and thinking about how terrifying it must have been to be a Berliner at the time, seeing tanks from two of the world's most powerful armies face off right in front of you. It's a reminder of how fragile peace can be and how easily things can spiral out of control. Imagine living in a world where a wrong move by a tank commander could change the course of history forever. It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? The tank face-off in Berlin in 1961 was more than just a Cold War standoff. It was a chilling reminder of how close the world came to destruction. While the tanks may have pulled back, the tension remained. And yet, in that moment, diplomacy won the day. It's a lesson that even in our darkest moments, dialogue and negotiation can prevent catastrophe. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most tense moments of the Cold War. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more untold stories from history. And hey, let me know in the comments, what do you think was the scariest moment of the Cold War?